Yes, thank you very much for organizing this conference and for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to show some of my research. I will actually try to bridge the first and the second panel a bit. I will not talk so much about history from the 19th century, but will concentrate more on the 20th century, and particularly in the first part of my talk on the last 20-25 years before I turn to the Spitsbergen Treaty as an approach to settle the disputes. So I will first talk about the Sino-US competition in the region, will then take, as a political scientist, a view on the power dynamics in the region before turning to the SCS disputes. As all of you know, China and the US are engaged in a serious strategic competition over Asia-Pacific's future regional order. And in this context, the disputes in the SCS are a political powder keg. So we have to see the disputes linked to the overall strategic rivalry between the US and China, and to the dynamics that have been taking place in the power structure in the regions. Both countries are caught, or actually the whole region is caught in what Graham Allison has called a Thucydides trap. The Thucydides trap tries to explain, or tries to bring some importance to the fact that since 1500 there have been 15 cases where great powers, a rising great power and an established great power have met each other, and in 11 out of these 15 cases there has been war, mostly lost by the rising power. As a German, I can tell you this is not a funny thing. So this is a very serious situation there. China rising, the US as an established hegemon, and the SCS disputes are in this context a political powder keg. Now let me briefly come to the Sino-US competition. As you know, China has overtaken the US GDP based in PPP, purchasing power parity, in October 2014. This has been the first time that this has happened since more than 120 years that the US has not had the biggest GDP in the world. Neither Hitlerist Germany and Imperial Japan, combined with their allies, nor the Soviet Union with all their client states, ever had that much of an economy. At the same time, China has invested much in its defense structure, always above the rise of its economic growth, its GDP growth rate, mostly in the double digits, only recently single digits, but still above the GDP growth rate. And this has led to considerable changes in the ratio between the US and Chinese military expenditures. This is a chart from based on CIPRI figures, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and it shows that at the end of the Cold War, in 1991, 1992, the US spent almost 25 times as much on defense as China. And within 20 years, this went down to below 5 times as much. If you look at the latest figures, it is about 3 times as much. If you take purchasing power parity, which would be a much better evaluation, it is about 2.5 times as much. So within a generation, we had an astonishing shift in the military expenditure structure. Moreover, China has been outspending other regional nations by a particular margin. China now spends all other regions in Asia-Pacific, with the exception of the US, of course. So these are some of the little indicators that push the narrative that China is getting richer and more powerful and threatens the US role in Asia-Pacific, and that both nations might head for conflict. However, as a political scientist, I was astonished to find out that there was no extensive power alliances been done so far since the end of the Cold War. And I took it up to myself to do such a thing. And power in political science, as most of you will know, is a cluster of concepts. There is not a single definition, no uniform understanding is there. So basically what we can do when we look at the literature, we can distinguish between three types of power, which would be aggregate power, mostly related to realist theories, capabilities, resources you have, and this is power from something, and 2 types of power over, relational power and structural power. Relational power mostly connected with the work of Max Weber, Robert Dahl, Hans Morgenthau, and structural power connected to the work of Susan Strange, Andrei Pustovitovsky, Shuvogou, and others. So I looked at two of these dimensions, aggregate power and relational power, because structural power is quite hard to track down to, and Chevaugoux actually argues that it has trapped itself into a dead end. And I did an aggregate power analysis, but again I discovered that there is no canon in IR on which, in international relations, on which variables, on which I can base my measurement on various, so most scholars use population, territory, GDP, military expenditures, but what about mineral wealth, what about economics, what about food dependency, etc. so far. There's one exception to this, Ray Klein. Ray was the Director of Intelligence and Research at the US State Department, served as the Deputy Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and was also the longtime Executive Director of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. And he constructed a composite indicator, and I used his work and the work of Randall Schweller, who adopted his work, Klein's work in 1998, to formulate an own composite indicator on aggregate power, which tried to measure the power dynamics in the region since the end of the Cold War. It encompasses 54 indicators and is for 44 political entities in the region. So basically all countries of the region. Was quite a lot of work to do. Because it was so much data, I only did 5 years, which all in all is like 10,000 data arrays in 5-year rows. So I have an evaluation from 1992 to 2012. This I used to find out how the power shifted in the aggregated power definition. I used a leader-laggard standardization, which is quite simple to explain. The leader is awarded 100 points in each category, and the laggard always gets 100. And all the other nations are grouped in between. And I used several weighting scenarios as a sensitivity test and reliability test. So this is how the composite indicator on aggregate power looks like. As you can see, it basically has 3 components: critical mass, which is the usual size of population, territory, then a big chunk of economic capability, ranging from the domestic economy to energy supply, certain non-fuel minerals, the industrial capacities, the food production capacities, and the position a nation has in trade and finance. And lastly, of course, the very important segment of military capability. And it was interesting for me to see that in all scenarios, of course, China grew, China has risen. This is just one example taken from the CIAP2, so the second scenario. You must read it like this. In the beginning, China has like 34 points, the US has, of course, 100, and over the time, China rises up to 82. So in that time, in all scenarios, China is basically catching up to the United States. There was one scenario which I found quite interesting, in which China outranked the United States. And that was something I didn't expect, to be honest. But again, that was a scenario in which I awarded equal weight to all of the cluster indicators. So what we can take from this is, in all scenarios, the narrative is true. China's risen, China's rises there, at least if you take such a composite indicator with all its statistical failures. Because what you measure is what you measure. And sometimes you measure the wrong things. So what about relational power analysis? Again, there has been no standard method established. There are many approaches available, but most of them, actually all of them, I found very hard to apply to actual research. So I came up with my own case study analysis, and I looked at 2 methods and combined 2 methods. One is the comparative historical analysis, and the other one the structured focus comparison. And I won't spend much time on explaining these, but when you're interested, I'm happy to explain them later to you. And I looked at 3 segments: political, security, and economic affairs, and had 10 indicators all in all to look at. And I decided to look at not all the 44 states, but at some more important ones, the regional middle powers. For this, I developed a mid-range theory that allows me to track relational power dynamics, because I argue that a shift in allegiance of middle powers can be taken as a latent indicator for relational power shift. So this is quite simple. If a middle power's allegiance is won by a great power, the aggregated and to some extent the relational power of that middle power is added to the great power's regional influence. This is a chart taken from Hans Morgenthau, who was very influential for my work. and basically sums up what I said before. So even if, for example, A is China, has more aggregate power, the influence B has the allegiance B has won with other smaller states with lesser powers, allows it to compete with the greater A. So what did the relation power analysis showed me? First, I had to identify middle powers in Asia Pacific, so I did a K-means cluster analysis for one of the scenarios, and it yielded 6 countries to look closer to: Australia, Japan, South Korea, Thailand, Pakistan, and Indonesia. And I also did, of course, a cluster analysis of all the other countries for the other CIAPs I did, for the other composite indicators I did. And Vietnam was ranked twice as a middle power. But I decided, because there was still much work to do, that I skipped Vietnam. But I think Vietnam has the best option to be actually considered a middle power in Asia Pacific. The best outlook, sorry. So then I did this analysis with CHA and SFC on the bilateral relations with the US and China. And I discovered, after an extensive analysis, that there is no general shift in allegiance. Many states actually have stronger allegiances to the United States, or about the same as 20 years ago. So despite the talk of power shift, there has not been a relational power shift. The only country where I could identify a shift in allegiance was Pakistan. Pakistan has moved much closer to China in recent years. So this outlines a strategic dilemma for China. It has more means, but not as much partners as it would like to get in order to achieve own ends. And this is also a problem for China in the SCS disputes. And in this context, there's a useful lesson to be taken from Europe's past. Scholars have called for creative diplomatic solutions that are needed to diffuse the disputes in the area. And I have thought about, maybe we can look in Europe's diplomatic history and find something that may be of use to that region. And I found something I believe it can be of help. So this is still very much work in progress, and as I'm sure you will find out, quite creative. Spitsbergen. What is Spitsbergen? Most of you won't know this, I believe. It is quite a big archipelago in the Arctic Sea. It has been discovered in the late 16th century. It is as big as Sri Lanka or West Virginia, and it was very important in the beginning for energy, whaling. The fat was used for perfume, etc. Fur, meat, and the area has been contested for many centuries. The Danish and the Norwegian kingdom claimed it. The English king claimed it. Both claimed sovereignty. Other countries like France, Russia, Spain, the Netherlands, and Germany declared it to be a mare liberum. So it's a free area where you can do what you want. If you want to hunt, you've got the right to do that. And this, of course, led to violence, not large-scale violence, but still people got killed. This is another map on the area. In the 19th century, Spitsbergen gained the legal status of terra nullius. It was an international free-for-all, meaning that there were no rules, no regulations, no tribunals to solve conflicts, no management of the maritime resources, no real exploitation taking place. Then something happened in the late 19th century. Coal deposits were discovered. Big problem. Why? Because new mining technologies made exploitation attractive and possible. And we had a naval race and an energy race going on in the region at the time, in Europe at the time. So rising great powers, the German Empire, France, the Russian Empire, etc., and so on, were all looking to that archipelago and were assessing whether they could gain somehow, some way or the other. And it took until the Great War, until the end of the Great War, that regional states actually came up with a solution to that problem. And I think the Spitsbergen Treaty, which is the solution, might be of help for settling some of the disputes in the SCS and at least ease the tensions there. So, in Article 1 in the Spitsbergen Treaty, it is argued that parties undertake to recognize the full and absolute sovereignty of Norway. So Norway is granted sovereignty. Big achievement. Article 2 and 3 establish the principles of non-discrimination and equal access. So, for example, French or English ships are allowed to fish and hunt in the area. go on land, slaughter the animals they want to get, and at the same time, the nationals of all signatories shall be admitted on a footing of absolute equality to the exercise and practice of all maritime, industrial, mining, or commercial enterprises. This was a huge step forward. So they can actually see that the Spitsbergen Treaty merged the terra nullius concept with that of national sovereignty. Both components are in there. This goes even further when you look at two other aspects, limited sovereignty and demilitarization, I call it. Norway is fiscally limited and is only allowed to levy as much taxes, dues, and duties on Spitsbergen as it needs to administer the island, because it has a management obligation to do. It is managing the exploitation, the mining exploitations. It is managing the fisheries in these territorial waters, etc., and so on and so forth. And in the past, Norway has actually spent more money on Spitsbergen than it has gained out of it. And so mainland taxpayers are paying for Spitsbergen. Very much important for the SCS would be that Norway is not allowed to create nor to allow the establishment of any naval base and not to construct any fortification in the said territories, which may never be used for warlike purposes. And in fact, Norway has banned, or has argued that military presence of other countries is unwelcome, and has only have very, very limited maritime forces there. It's basically, what is the English term? I forgot. Coast Guard, thank you very much. The nice thing about the Spitsbergen Treaty is that it was recently put in Asian Pacific news, because two countries, there are 43 countries now who have joined the treaty, several nations from Asia Pacific, China, Japan, India, Australia, and very recently North and South Korea. So South Korea and North Korea are now allowed to go there, mine, fish, etc. So what can we take out of this? There are three principles which should be applied to the South China Sea. First, non-discrimination and equal access. Second, clear sovereignty, a bit restrictive though. And third, final, and perhaps the most important point, full demilitarization of certain parts. This could bring, as in the case of Spitsbergen, a durable strategic stability and joint economic development in the region. So, in a sense, regional power dynamics and the great power rivalry in the region must be recognized in the SCS disputes. China has a rising aggregate power base, as I have lined out. It is engaged in a strategic competition with the United States, as other scholars present here will explain later in more detail, in greater detail. And it also lacks the allegiance of most regional, middle, and small states. So it's basically a lone superpower, or lone great power. There are several aspects that can be discussed with regards to the Spitsbergen approach. I only focus on one aspect here, the question of sovereignty, which has blocked joint development and exploitation of the SCS so far, because China is very much happy to go into other nations' areas and exploit the resources there, but is unwilling to let other nations come into the areas it claims. With regards to the Spitsbergen approach and sovereignty, three scenarios are possible. There's one important precondition, and I think I will take some flag later in the question and answer section for this, but I think it is a good idea to divide the SCS into three segments: the Paracels, the Spratlys, and Scarborough. And I think, given the power dynamics and the great power rivalry, China will be granted sovereignty over Paracels, even though I believe that Vietnam has very good historic claims. But I believe that there's only one realistic option if you grant China sovereignty, and if you then go on to discuss the sovereignty of the second and the third segment. This is unsatisfying for many observers. I totally understand this, but I think that the reality of great power politics has to be acknowledged in this context. China seeks security for its coastal areas. I think Carl will talk about this later. And given the historic invasions of Western colonial powers and Japanese imperialism, it is actually making sense in this context. So the question for the second and the third segment is, who gains the sovereignty over the Spratly Islands and Scarborough? There are three possible scenarios. First, only regional, middle, and small powers gain sovereignty. Second, China. China is basically pushing through its 9, or actually I think you should say 10 10-dash line, because they recently included Taiwan in one of these dashes. Or the current control nations exercise in the regions is accepted and granted. What might work best? I think that scenario 1 is probably best because middle and small powers are not directly engaged in the great power rivalry. As we can see when we look at the Spitsbergen Treaty, Norway, a NATO founding member, so very close to the United States, upheld the principles of the Spitsbergen Treaty even in the most intense phases of the Cold War. So the island was never militarized, was never used for anything to counter the Soviet Union's access to the Atlantic, which it had to, oh yeah, thank you. In a sense, the territories are strategically neutralized when you award middle and small powers the right of sovereignty, based on the other principles, or including the other principles of non-discrimination and demilitarization, which would allow economic cooperation and joint exploitation to take place, ease the security dilemma, and would also involve the US, just like in the Spitsbergen Treaty, as an important signatory who is enforcing rules of the treaty. On the other hand, the option 2 and 3 entailed the dangers of what I call a Munich moment, because you can never be sure whether China is just, trying to be nice at the time and will not change the rules of the game at a later point when it feels more confident. And I think we have seen this in the past with China. So in order to limit the likelihood of a Chinese monodoctrine in the South China Sea, I opt for scenario 1. So what is the conclusion? The SCS disputes needs to be seen in the context of Sino-US rivalry and regional power dynamics. Since the end of the Cold War, China has gained considerably in aggregated power, but less in relational. It is an isolated power. There has been no power shift in Asia-Pacific that disadvantages the United States. China is a great power, and in that great power rivalry, I think we are wise if we take the security interests of that great power serious. Chinese actions have actually fostered the relational power developments of the United States. So finding a durable solution to the SCS disputes is also in the interest of China. Simply pushing around weaker states pushes those states in the US corner. China thus needs to bind itself by international law. I think the Spitsbergen approach served Europe's great and middle powers quite well, and seems to me to be a viable option due to the principles of non-discrimination and demilitarization. And I believe as a signatory, the US would be an important guarantor of the treaty, just like in the case of the Spitsbergen Treaty. Thank you very much.